We're dealing with a first in American history here, a former president facing criminal charges. Can you believe it? You've asked for a deep dive on the legal arguments in special counsel Jack Smith's case against Donald Trump, and, well, it all really comes down to this motion for immunity determinations.
Right. It's like the bedrock of the case. So basically, the government's laying out exactly why they think they can prosecute Trump for what he did after the 2020 election, even though, he was president at the time.
And that's the big question, isn't it? Because the presidency, it comes with some pretty significant legal protections.
Oh, absolutely it does. But it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. And that's what's so fascinating about this whole thing. The Supreme Court already weighed in on some parts of it, narrowing it down to certain actions Trump took, and this motion zeroes in on what's left, whether those actions are protected or not.
So what are we looking at here? What's the government's reasoning, their stance for pushing forward with this?
Their whole argument hinges on this idea. They're saying a lot of what Trump did after the election, it wasn't official presidential stuff,
Yeah.
It was more like a personal scheme to hold on to power. They're drawing a line, right, between Trump as president and Trump as just a candidate.
Okay, so let's get into that. This motion, it lays out their whole case. What are some of the key details they use, these details that really support this whole private citizen argument?
Well, they've got this really, I think, a compelling timeline of events laid out. For instance, they highlight that even before the 2020 election, Trump was publicly, already making statements about potential election fraud.
Yeah.
Almost like, he was setting the stage to challenge the results before there even were any results.
So planting those seeds of doubt early on. Okay, so how does this tie into their argument about Trump acting as a candidate?
Well, think about it this way. If a president is really worried about election integrity, they might work with their administration, intelligence agencies, maybe even reach out to both parties to make sure things are fair. But the motion really emphasizes how Trump's actions, they were different.
Different how?
Well, the government is really emphasizing how Trump specifically targeted certain state officials, right?
Okay.
And not just any officials, but ones in states that he lost, particularly ones from his own party. And we're not talking just casual conversations here. They cite times when he made claims about election fraud that were, verifiably false, even when he was shown evidence to the contrary.
So it sounds like they're painting a very deliberate picture, a very deliberate narrative here.
Exactly. They even include direct quotes, like in that call he had with Georgia's Secretary of State, remember, where Trump says, and I quote, "I just want to find 11,780 votes." It's not really the kind of statement you'd expect from someone just, expressing concern about national presidential duties.
Yeah, it really does feel like they're saying, look, his words speak for themselves. This wasn't some president expressing worry. This was a candidate who was desperate to hold on to power.
And that's really the core of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
They argue that the things he was saying, when he said them, and even the way he said them, often aggressive, aiming to shake people's confidence in the election, it all points to him acting as a private citizen, a candidate focused on his own interests.
It's fascinating, this whole idea of content, context, and form. They're not just looking at what he did, but like you said, how and why he did it.
Yeah, and that's really key here to understanding their whole argument against presidential immunity. It's not enough to just say, well, he was the president, so he's protected. They're really dissecting his behavior to figure out if he was actually acting within the scope of his presidential duties.
Okay, so where do we go from here? We've got the government's core argument down, this whole President Trump versus candidate Trump thing. But how does presidential immunity actually work? Does it apply in some cases and not others? And if so, how on earth do they determine which is which?
Well, that's where things get really, really interesting, and that's what we'll dive into next.
I'm hooked. I'm ready.
Yeah.
Let's unpack this whole idea of presidential immunity and see how it might, how it might apply to this case.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. Presidential immunity, it's complicated. It's not as simple as, you're president, you can't be touched. It's not a blanket protection.
Right. So break it down for us. Where do we even begin with this whole thing?
Okay, so generally we're talking about two main types of presidential immunity.
Yeah.
Absolute and presumptive. Absolute immunity is fairly straightforward. It covers things directly laid out in the Constitution, like when a president pardons someone or vetoes a bill. Those are protected, no question.
Okay, so absolute immunity, that's for those core presidential powers. Got it. What about this presumptive immunity? That one sounds a little vague.
Yeah, you're right. Presumptive immunity, that's where the government's really focusing their argument in this case. It's about actions that might be part of a president's duties, but they're not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. It's that gray area where you have to really look at the content, context, and form to decide if a president was acting within their role or not.
So, using that framework, how exactly is the government arguing against immunity for these specific things Trump did?
Well, they make a pretty strong case by highlighting specific actions that really seem to go beyond what a president should be doing. For example, remember the whole fake electors scheme?
Right, the plan to put forward those alternate slates of electors in states that Trump lost?
Exactly. That's a key part of their argument. The motion lays out in detail Trump's efforts to organize these slates. And again, they highlight how this involved people outside of his official capacity, campaign staff, lawyers, even state GOP officials were involved.
Right. So they're drawing a clear line, then, between official presidential actions and things that look more like a political campaign.
Absolutely. They're basically implying this wasn't a president acting on advice from, official advisors, but more like a candidate working through his own network to sway the election. And they don't just stop at phone calls and meetings. They even bring up his use of Twitter, which, let's face it, was a huge part of his presidency.
Right, that was his platform.
Exactly. And that's where they get into this whole can of worms of free speech. They're acknowledging a president's right to speak out on important matters, sure. But they argue that presidential immunity, it doesn't give someone a free pass to spread disinformation or incite violence.
And they're not just talking about any tweets here. All right, this is all about those tweets related to January 6th.
Exactly. They're laser focused on those.
Yeah.
They point to specific tweets urging his supporters to come to Washington that day, tweets attacking Mike Pence for not going along with his plan, even that one where he tells the rioters, we love you, you're very special.
It's hard to imagine any of those being seen as official presidential communication.
Right, and the government knows that. They really emphasize this by contrasting them with tweets sent from the official at POTS account, which were generally more, measured, focused on actual official business. It seems like they're building this case that Trump purposely used his personal platform, which had a huge reach, to push a very specific message and incite action.
So it sounds like they're saying these actions weren't just about expressing his opinion. They were part of a deliberate attempt to overturn the election. And that went way beyond what a president is allowed to do.
You got it. They're using these specific examples to really chip away at the idea that everything Trump did was protected by this presidential immunity thing.
Yeah.
But they go even further. They bring in another element to back up their case, and that's legal precedent.
Oh, yes. Lawyers and their precedents. What past cases are they using?
Well, they bring up a bunch of cases, and historical examples, too, to show that presidents have historically had a limited role in elections. They even quote Lincoln, who said the president has no say in how states run their elections.
So it's not just a legal argument, it's a historical one, too.
Exactly. They're saying this isn't just their take on it, it's how it's always been done. They argue the Founding Fathers, they created a system where the president wouldn't have too much influence on elections, and that what Trump did went against that. They even highlight the Electoral College and how a president can't just appoint electors as evidence.
Okay, so they've got this case built on law and history, but I'm sure Trump's lawyers are going to have something to say about all of this, right? There will be counter-arguments.
Oh, absolutely. This is high stakes, and we can definitely expect a strong defense. In fact, why don't we switch gears a bit and look at some of the ways Trump's team might try to push back on these accusations and protect their client.
All right, let's do it. Let's dive into the potential defenses we might see.
It's important to remember, right, this motion, it's just one side of the story. It's the government's perspective, their game plan. But Trump's lawyers, they have options, and we've already seen hints of how they might approach this.
So what could their defense look like? What kind of arguments could they make to counter all of this?
Well, one strategy, and it's a common one, is to say, hey, Trump was just exercising his First Amendment rights, his right to free speech. They might claim he was just expressing an opinion, raising concerns about the election, which any citizen can do, even a former president.
So it was just talk, basically. We've heard that one before.
Right, exactly. But the government, they're ahead of that argument. They emphasize that free speech, well, it has its limits, especially for a president. They'll likely argue that Trump's words had real consequences, that they directly led to those actions, the pressure on Pence, the fake electors, and of course, January 6th.
So it's less about just voicing concerns and more about potentially causing, unlawful actions?
Exactly. Now, another defense we might see is the whole advice of counsel argument. Trump's lawyers could say, look, he was just listening to his legal team. He genuinely believed what he was doing was legal.
Interesting. But doesn't that kind of, shift the blame to those advisors?
It could. And it also depends on whether they can prove Trump actually believed that advice. You know, he's known for sometimes doing things his own way, even when advisors disagree. It might be hard to convince a jury of that.
Especially with all those instances where he pushed back on people who told him straight up, your fraud claims, they're baseless. Seems like the government's ready to counter that one, too.
Oh, yeah, they do their homework. And then there's this other thing, the way the government itself is handling the case. They've been very deliberate, and one detail that really stands out to me is how they're using redactions in the indictment. Remember all those blacked out sections about Trump's talk with the Justice Department?
Right. Those are interesting.
Well, by keeping that information under wraps, they're basically saying, we don't even need this to prove our point. They're narrowing the focus to their absolute strongest arguments.
So streamlining their case, making it harder for Trump's team to muddy the waters, create distractions.
Exactly. This is all about Trump's actions as a candidate, not the president. And they're laser focused on that. It's a high-stakes game of legal chess, and they're playing it very carefully.
It's incredible, isn't it? No matter what happens, this case feels like a turning point.
It really does. We're talking about the limits of presidential power, about accountability, the fragility of democracy, all of it. And if they actually prosecute Trump successfully, it sets a major precedent. Future presidents, they'll have to think twice about their actions, even after they leave office.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure. It makes you think about that balance, right? Allowing presidents to question election results, which is important, but also preventing these baseless claims, potential abuses of power.
Absolutely. This isn't just about Trump. It's about protecting our elections, our democracy as a whole. And this conversation, it's not going away anytime soon, even after this trial is over.
A conversation for the history books, without a doubt. Well, this deep dive has been, as always, incredibly insightful. Thank you. I always learn so much from these conversations. I hope our listeners feel the same way.
You're very welcome. It's always a pleasure to be here.
As we navigate this uncharted territory, it's so important to stay informed, understand the arguments, and really think about what all of this means for the future, for our nation's future. This has been The Deep Dive. Thank you for joining us as we explored this legal battle that, let's face it, has captivated the nation. And hopefully, we'll see you on our next Deep Dive.
In deep space, between the Sun and Earth, humanity's last hope orbits at the L1 Lagrange point, Eden Station. With our world on the brink of collapse, humanity's survival depends on the energy harvested from our life-giving star, the Sun. But deep space is a dangerous place for humans. The Sun regularly bombards Eden with furious coronal mass ejections of high-energy particles. This makes working on Eden very hazardous for humans. One creation holds the key to our future. Adam, the first ever advanced artificial super general intelligence robot. Only a robot can work long-term in safety on the life-giving Eden Station. Mary and Judd are tasked with training and testing Adam to become commander of Eden Station. But even in the depths of space, conflict brews. The shadows of the past emerge, threatening to destroy everything. Adam, the Son of Man, a tale of artificial intelligence, human resilience, and the search for redemption in the darkest of times. Discover the future. Embrace the unknown. Experience the epic journey. Adam, the Son of Man. Available now on Amazon.